Hello everyone, welcome to the Megagame Museum, the wonderful opening of the Megagame Museum. I am your curator, Patrick Rose, entirely because I decided I wanted the job and wanted to make the job exist. So that's why I have it. I've got a wonderful panel of experts or people who know things about Megagames, one of the two. So I'll go through everyone and talk about, and then we can talk about what this wonderful thing is. So if you don't know who I am, I'm Patrick Rose. So I'm the treasurer for the Pennine Megagames group, who run games in the north of England, in the Pennine region, as the name might suggest. So that's Sheffield, Leeds, York, Manchester, that sort of region. I've also designed a pre-cyberpunk megagame called Running Hot, which has been run a lot over the last years because it's one of the online games that ran. So in theory, I know what I'm talking about, but also I probably don't. And that's the entire point of today. Our first panelist is Alex Beck. Alex Beck's a megagame designer who runs Horizon Megagames, which is down in the London sort of area, who hosts sci-fi, fantasy, and horror games, and is intermittently working on documenting the history of megagames. How are you doing, Alex?
All right, thank you.
Are you looking forward to using your actual knowledge and actual research for this?
Yeah, let's say yes. Yes, that research.
My next panelist is BeckyBecky Campbell-Ladley. BeckyBecky is the narrative-heavy designer of Everybody Dies, which is the Game of Thrones Megagames, and Trope High, the fantasy American high school megagame. Voracious blogger over at BeckyBecky and also the MegaCon organising committee, which is not the only reason she's in this panel. How are you doing, Becky?
Yeah, really good. Really looking forward to this.
What's the sort of thing that you're thinking you're going to bring to our wonderful museum?
Well, I went to one mega game prior to Watch the Skies, so I think really I'm bringing the history element here, despite the fact that there are obviously a lot of mega gamers that have been mega gaming for longer than I've been alive, but let's say the history element.
And my last panel is Dr. Dillon Burke, who's been running Megagames in New Zealand since the early 1990s, helped found the Wellington Megagames Collective, and is currently employed by New Zealand Defence Force as a concept and wargaming program manager. How are you doing, Dillon?
I'm doing well, thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Yeah, we were talking in the podcast that set off the con that for us it's at 9 o'clock, and we've all basically got the beers out, and then we were all saying, well, Dillon probably won't because it's 9 a.m. I think over there because you're in New Zealand, so something like that. But then
I do have one.
That's okay then. We're doing this properly. As you might have heard, this is the Megagame Museum. So we're basically building a Megagame Museum, as the name would suggest. We're basically going to put a whole bunch of things in there. As this museum does not exist, we can put whatever the hell we like in it. We can put in whole actual Megagames, we can put in abstract concepts and that sort of stuff. So we're going to pretty much do that for the next hour or so. In case it's not clear, this is not a serious panel. If you came to this panel expecting like a really deep dive into the history of Megagames, I'm really sorry for what's about to happen. We've got a couple of different things that we're going to start. I've got some various wings of the museum we're going to. So we're going to go through. We're going to go through each of the various things as the game, for want of a better word, goes on. If you've got any thoughts for the wings that we're talking about, or any thoughts about the games that we mention or the mechanics, etc., then feel free to just dump them in the chat. We'll call them out. I'm also got the Q&A open as well, so you can do both of that. So let's kick things off then with the obvious and easy round, which is probably the main feature of the Megagame Museum, which is an actual megagame. So I asked my curators to come up with a megagame that they feel should be put in the museum, and I'll go around in order. But of course, as the curator, I get to go first, which means that I got to pick one, which means no one else is going to have picked it. But I won't have picked the one that I don't think a lot of people would have picked. I picked The Shot Heard Around the Universe by Tim Campbell-Ladley. And you might be thinking that I'm picking it because it's the first megagame I play. And I kind of am. But also, I think it's an absolutely fantastic game and kind of showcases a lot about what the megagame space can do. So if you've not heard of Shot Heard Around the Universe, this is the American Revolution in space game, which I didn't realize was the American Revolution in space until about sometime last year. So if you'd spotted that, then you're a lot smarter than I am. But yeah, I really liked it because one of the things that megagames, the core feature I think to a megagame is the fact that something happens and you have no idea what that was, and it doesn't matter where that thing happened. It could have been like quite close to you. I know that in my experience, a lot of the stuff that was happening, even in my own team, I didn't really know what was going on until it came back to bite me in my end of the game, like 5-10 minutes later, which meant, of course, that I did the traditional diplomatic aid thing of lying to someone saying no, that we hadn't done a bombing run on their planet, even though we'd literally just done a bombing run on their planet. So it's a lot of good. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Shot. Becky, you were on the control team for that. Have you any additional insights on Shot?
Yeah, I was Constitution and Krill control at that game, and I helped Tim with some aspects of the prep for it as well. And yeah, I'd second your thoughts that it's a really, really great game with a really, really sort of rich theming to the world, and I think I really enjoyed the Krill part of the game because, as I said, I was managing that, and there was some really fun mechanics there regarding they got messages that were Rorschach blots that they had to interpret. This was how the Krill overlords communicated. I can't remember the exact details. The Krill overlords were communicating with the Krill. But they were actually being picked out by one of the Krill members, but the Krill couldn't reveal which one it was. And so every single part of the Shot Heard Around the Universe had that level of sort of detail and thought that went into the individual teams. So yeah, great addition. I would actually agree. Let's put that in the museum.
Good.
So yeah, maybe just to counter that a little bit and play devil's advocate for fun. I do enjoy it when I played it in Reading, which I think is a slightly amended one. But is it the iconic space game? If we're going to put a space empire game, there are lots of others out there. Is it the iconic one?
I'd argue it is, but again, that's because I'm entirely the I'm the curator. So Dillon, I think you've have you got any questions about what Shot is? Because you're coming in this entirely blind compared to us three, because it was a UK run game.
Yeah, I guess this is just the downside of living on the other side of the world, is we get to miss all the cool parties. But we do always appreciate the blogs and stuff that people write after such games, and I try to share them around the locals here to inspire people. But the two most well-known foreign designs, as it were, would still be Watch the Skies and Den of Wolves. Watch the Skies has been run both here in Wellington and in Auckland, and Den of Wolves was the single most popular game I've ever run, with 50 people taking part.
That doesn't surprise me. Let's take some submissions then. So Alex, let's start with you. What game have you brought?
So I think as we're talking games here, and I guess as a history guy from the work I've been doing intermittently the last year or two, I'm going to put in try and put in anyway, the very first mega game. So at least the first game recognised as such, which is Memphis Mangler, back in March 1981. I spoke about it last year, but basically it was a sort of Vietnam war game that had a lot of kind of modern sort of mega gamey ideas to it, sort of people in roles, political elements, military elements, and it's gone down in the legend as the first mega game. So yeah, I think if we've got to have a museum, you've got to have the first one there. It'd be like having a natural history museum without the dinosaurs. So yeah, that's what I'm putting forward.
It's a fair argument to say that if you didn't have a dinosaur in the Natural History Museum, it wouldn't be there. So, but one of the things I think, you can argue that it should be there, but would that game still hold up nowadays, do you think?
I mean, I doubt it, I'll be honest. I mean, we'd have to possibly speak to Jim or some of the others who were there at the time. But, being the first one, I think we'd probably find it quite pretty old-fashioned in its mechanics. And, it was coming out of a very war game tradition at that time. They were just experimenting with those kind of ideas. So, yeah, probably not. But, the first one of anything's never going to be perfect, right? You got to start somewhere.
Fair enough. Dillon, do you want to tell us what game you brought for this?
I bought, well, because I'm without shame tonight, my own design, the Colossus of Atlantis. So if you can think of a giant bronze robot looming over the museum, and if nothing else, it's perhaps an entry for the record books in terms of longest distance someone has flown to run a game, in that I went from New Zealand to Indianapolis and ran it at Gen Con a few years back as part of the Megagame coalition there.
So what sort of game was that then? See, what sort of mechanics were involved in that sort of thing? Because that's one that's new to me. Obviously, if it was ran literally the other side of the world, both of the other sides of the world, as you want to call it.
So if we think of it as being a bit of a journey game, in that you kind of know what the outcome is like if you're familiar with the myths. You know, King Arthur's Camelot, you know it's all going to end in tears, but how do you get there at the end? That's the interesting bit. So Atlantis is obviously fated to sink below the waves, and the players are the factions in Atlantis: your tyrants, your Amazons, your democrats, your oligarchs, your monarchists, your slave-owning militarists, and all that kind of stuff. And they're in a competition and cooperation dynamic because they're all competing for land and glory, but they're also cooperating with each other against any external adversaries or kaiju or dinosaurs or pirates or anything else that the control team wants to throw at them. And I first ran it back in 2012. I've run it 4 times since then, and I have made so many mistakes with it. It's been my learning game of, I can definitely do this better next time.
If that's not a feeling held by literally every mega game designer, then I would be very surprised. I know that, like, with my game running hot, when I've looked at it since and just gone, that bit just doesn't work. Why did I even do that? And my solution to the problem was just to cut that role entirely, which then meant I didn't have to think about it anymore, which worked for a given value of worked. Lastly, then, Becky, what game do you want to bring?
So I'm copying you, Patrick, in that I am shamelessly bringing my first mega game, the first mega game that I attended to this, partly because obviously it brought me into the scene and I'm very important. I would like my own pedestal in this museum, FYI, but also because I think it is a classic example of a historical, political, military game, and that is Renaissance and Reformation. So it is set in Renaissance Europe. So, or as I knew it at the time when I first came along to it, Henry VIII was king, and I was told it's like the Tudors, which I was binging at the time. So it's covers all of Europe. I'm not entirely sure what the spread was. I think there was Ottomans. There was definitely France, Spain, England, Holy Roman Empire, bits of Italy. I can't remember exactly. I have played in it twice, actually. The second run I played in it as Foxes and Devils. I didn't enjoy it quite as much, but yeah, no, the first run of Renaissance and Reformation was fantastic. And yeah, as I said, it's quite a classic example of a historical, political, military game, which has been the genre of a lot of mega games, in that people were making negotiations, religion was playing a big part, there were wars, there were marriages, alliances and things like that. And when I was invited along to it by Tim, who is now my husband, although at the time we were not even together, I said outright that I wouldn't come along if I couldn't get a female role. So he messaged the designer, Brian Cameron, and said, can you get a female role into this game? It was quite close to the game starting as well. And he wrote one in for me. So I came along and played Queen Mother of France. And I spent the entire day marrying off so many of my son's children that they ended up closing down the marriages table, because I just kept trying to betroth, like, we've had another baby. Can we betroth it to someone, anyone? Like... Yeah, so yeah, classic example of that game. Has all of the different elements you might expect of a political military game set in a historical time period, and it was just, yeah, very, very good game, and it got me hooked. So
that's a good thing. I think so. What I expected to happen was we were going to fight over who was bringing Watch the Skies, and literally no one has done it.
I think it's almost like it's an auto entry. Maybe that and Den of Wolves are two that, you know, do we even need to debate them? No, I mean, I think, you know, they're in there, aren't they? You know, so.
I think that is a completely fair comment. I think if you didn't put Watch the Skies in a Mega Game Museum, you would be doing this fake history that we're inventing like a massive disservice. I don't think any of those don't deserve to be in a museum, so let's just throw them in anyway because we've got an infinite budget. Oh, go on then.
Oh.
Go on then.
I have a question. So, Alex, was it the first mega game, or was it just the first time someone said mega game at it? Is it like a chicken and the egg situation? Like what made it the first mega game besides someone saying this is a mega game?
You know what, I think you're right, and Jim and other people have said the same. It was just the one that probably got the labelled that, you know, famously, or maybe not famously, but to a few people we know, Andy Callan said, you know, oh, this isn't just a game, it's a mega game, you know, and it was just one in a whole, you know, series of similar experiments that they did, and some straight after that, you know, didn't get called mega games, but were basically the same kind of thing. So I think there is some argument to that, but you know, if this is a serious museum, we have that whole bit that shows all the ones before and after, you know, there's that whole kind of evolution going on in a nice little exhibit, you know. But
we could have an interactive game for children where they have to sort games. Are they mega games or are they not mega games?
Yeah.
Oh, don't stop that argument. There'll be complaints in the suggestions box literally every week. Like, you can't call that a mega game. There's only 20 people in it. Well, no, shut up. So that's great. Okay, wonderful. I'm going to put all of that in. I think it is an interesting idea that Memphis Wrangler is the first mega game because it was called the first mega game, and where the line blurs. I think there's an interesting like 3-week exhibit about that at least, or if not a permanent one. And every 6 months when someone says, oh no, there was also this game that was quite similar and happening off on the side, that'll be a thing. It'll give us loads of Arts Council funding.
A continual academic debate, which is what you want.
Yeah. Right then, let's go to our next round then. So our next round, I asked for a mechanic in a mega game, and I was intentionally quite vague about what that was. I think I gave a couple of examples of what it was, but for a mechanic in a mega game, I literally just mean any mechanism that a player would interact with. So whether that would be on a diplomatic level or actually picking up some counters and moving things. So again, I'll start off again. So the one I brought is the Expeditions from It Belongs in a Museum by Jake Smithson, Ricardo Vigilance. I should have practiced that one. Vigilance and Danielle McLuhan. That makes more sense. Villanisi. So It Belongs in a Museum was the first True North game that I played. I think one of the first ones that True North ran. I think they were certainly a very baby network at that time. And It Belongs in a Museum is a game of Indiana Jones and Lara Croft and that sort of style of pop culture where you go off, you find random artifacts and bring them back. But the expedition mechanic, I think, is actually a thing of beauty because it solves a really hard problem in mega games, which is the 1 p.m. slump, where there's just too much stuff happening. You're trying to deal with several problems, most of which are your fault. You kind of don't really know what you're doing, and you kind of get paralyzed. And the expedition mechanic was, at the end of each turn, if you were an explorer, you could go off an expedition. And you didn't need to think about that. You could just go off on an expedition. There were some plot stuff if you were trying to do things about it. And that meant that you could just know, oh, it's okay. I don't know what I'm doing, but I can go off an expedition and that will do something. That will advance me in some way. Even if it doesn't advance my local plot, it means that I'm doing something that means I'm not going to be behind what some might call a power curve. And I found that really helpful. I think basically I got to the end of it and then I collapsed as opposed to halfway through when you just have a couple of breathers. I think the other reason that I think it deserves to be in the museum is it made mega gamers play pickup sticks, and that's still the funniest thing that any mega gamer has ever done. So big ups to them. I know you played this one, Becky, but I can't remember what your role was. I think I know at some point we insulted each other, but that doesn't necessarily narrow it down.
Yeah, I was Elsie Schneider. What was I? I was an explorer. I can't remember exactly what flavor of explorer I was, but I completely agree that the expedition mechanic was, it was just a very, it felt like mini, mini tabletop role-playing sessions within a mega game. And it felt very personal. And it was a way to have these sort of questing elements in without it detracting from the interplayer capacity, but still gave control way to do it. And I think the way that they implemented it into the game was brilliant, and it just led to so many great story elements, because you had this control player that was just talking you through the story of you going on this expedition. So yeah, I agree.
Let's go around there. Becky, you can start. What
Sure.
do you bring?
So I brought not so much a single mechanic, more a category of mechanics that I think could have their own little special section of the museum, which is people who bring other games into mega games. So a great example of this is Giant Jenga at Mirror Shades, where it represented, the economic stability of the city.
That was it. Yeah.
That's a great joke.
Yeah.
It was. It didn't really work, but because people just wanted to knock it down.
Anything like that, where you've got an existing game, especially one that looks cool and dramatic, was really good. I've used it in a few of my games. So in Everybody Dies, I had an ice sculpture where the maesters could go over and see whether it was melting or not. That was just because I had a free ice sculpture that I won in a competition. I wanted to, and I was like, what use do I have for an ice sculpture? Oh, I want to have it at this game, and the maesters can see if it's melting. I also used it at Trope High, where the forces of good and evil were playing, avatars of good and evil were playing Connect 4 against each other. Every time they managed to get one up over the other, they got a Connect 4 little thing. And then if they managed to, there was also Kaplunk in there as well. I can't exactly remember how that tied together, but yeah, just bringing other games that people would recognize and sort of like have that satisfying feeling to play into an existing game.
It also saves the designer having to build a whole new mini game. You've kind of got it there already, so it's just play Jenga or Kaplunk.
Yeah, and you know it's relatively balanced because it's being sold commercially. I mean, I say that like Monopoly exists, but relatively balanced.
Yeah, I wouldn't make anyone play Monopoly. That would be unfair.
I'm looking forward to someone saying, right, that's a challenge. You could make it work, I imagine, if you tried really hard. I don't know why you would.
Sort of purgatory,
not all challenges have to be accepted.
But yeah, the idea of bringing those big games, I know that, like, I think most of the advice, possibly I stole all this advice from you, Becky, was like, when you're designing your game, you could come up with your own mechanics or just nick mechanics from other games. Like you said they had the Kaplunk and stuff, but you also had the mind that was used for the band game, which I know because I was playing the band. Like Running Hot, like quite blatantly steals Netrunner for its run mechanic, though I think like Mirror Shades did.
Mirror Shades.
Yeah. And I thought, but like the Giant Jenga Tower, I quite like the ideas of Giant Jenga Towers, though I think I can't remember who it was, the person who ran Deep Haven, is it? The dwarf game. I think his design philosophy was that if you're going to put a Giant Jenga Tower in it and you haven't got a plan for when the Giant Jenga Tower goes off 4 turns too early, then you need to rethink your Giant Jenga Tower. Yeah,
that was the problem I had. It turned out that people just want to knock it over too quick, even though it really screwed over them, and they were going to do it anyway.
There's a regular GIF that gets posted in Megagame Discords of whoever it was who was the giant who was supposed to be holding it up, having to dejectedly push it over, and he just looks really sad and then has to walk away. It's one of my things. Let's move on. Alex.
So a bit like Becky, I've gone with a whole kind of, I guess, class of mechanics, and weirdly, it's a mechanic I absolutely despise in every way possible. But one that again is important to the history, so I think it belongs in a museum, and that's kind of what sort of classic war game, Kriegspiel combat resolution. So you've probably all played it in a lot of games. Combat strength of one army, combat strength of another army. Compare them. Roll a dice, perhaps look up on a table, probably chuck in a bunch of modifiers, whatever it is. It's a really classic mechanic. It's been used in thousands of games, mega games, board games, war games over the years. So I don't really like it. It's fiddly. It's very old school. I don't think it's much fun, but it has been used in so many mega games over the years, certainly in the olden days, if you will, when they were sort of evolving from war games. But even more recently, people still use it. I'm sure designs that have come out in the last couple of years still use it. So I think it's just such a kind of classic mechanic and used probably in more games than any others. I think it's got to go in the museum as kind of slightly irritating a mechanic as it is. So that's my suggestion. Combat resolution.
Yeah, I think combat resolution I think it's an important part of it if you have got any combat in it, but I think there's definitely some combat resolutions where I've looked at it and gone, that's fascinating, like as a as a game. Like,
yeah, outside of, there's the classic add the strings together, roll the dice is what I'm talking about, really, that kind of real classic wargame resolution. I think there's a lot of more interesting, better ones out there. I've tried different ones, other designers have too, so there's better ways to do it, but the classic one has still been used many times. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a quite big fan of the Red Planet Rising mechanic that I think what the original intention of the Red Planet Rising combat one, which was that, yeah, it was basically add up the strengths, whoever gets the bigger number wins the fight, but there was a level of bluffing behind it in that you could hide what you had. So there was basically the idea of basically saying, well, look, I've got all these things, but they're actually just stick men. I think that's quite an interesting interesting thing, and I think that makes, even though you're just still doing the resolution itself is boring, I think that's a nice crunch.
Yeah, I mean, and it's probably not a bad way to simulate combat, but it's just, so when you start getting into the ones that involve ratios and all that kind of stuff, it gets a bit fiddly especially for a mega game. But
I think the first thing that the design symposium that True North ran, I think Jim said at one point he had like a logarithmic combat mechanism for something, and got like 90% of the way through it before he realized this is a terrible idea. Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Sorry, what are you saying, Dillon?
I grew up on Avalon Hill board games and combat result charts and the 3-to-1 golden ratio. But yeah, when I'm sitting down and designing a game, it's like, where is the point where the player is making an interesting decision? And my gold standard combat mechanic that I look at is the one in the Dune board game that was first published in the 1970s. Because it involves traitors and a bid from the player, and everybody gets to play up to 2 cards to modify it. And there's no dice involved at all. So if you have a good read on the game situation, you can outthink the other players to victory, or you can get your numbers wrong by 1 point and watch your entire army wiped out in one battle.
Yeah, that's, I think if you're going to have, you want something that's interesting, that has interesting decisions, that's what a good mechanic is. But nonetheless, I'm still pushing it for the museum because I think it's important historically.
I am making a note of this because one of the things I'm looking at the moment is how to rework the combat for Everybody Dies, because I hate it. And I don't know how similar the modern Duneborn game is in terms of the combat mechanic. Pretty similar. That is a great idea. I am making a note, like 100% looking at that for Everybody Dies. So
see, this
for
museum
that,
is helping people.
It's educational.
Finally then, Dillon, what mechanic did you bring?
Right. My entry for the mechanic wing of the museum is a lifeboat from the good ship HMS Megagame. And a lifeboat mechanic is basically one where you are kicking someone out of the lifeboat. That's your decision-making sort of loop in a nutshell. And it can be, I've seen this done in a few different ways. I mean, you can, of course, have physical lifeboats are part of the game map, and this could be important when the Great Space Empire's latest warship, the Titanic, is on its maiden voyage through the asteroid belt. Or in Survivor Dark Lord, at the start of the game, most of the players were minions of the Dark Lord, and every 20 minutes, the Dark Lord would execute one of the minions. So the players are competing for favor with the Dark Lord and blaming everybody else for things going wrong. I then would resurrect the dead minions on the side of the rebellion, which is sort of a bull rush or British bulldog subgame, or in game theory terms, a positive feedback loop, as outlined in Chapter 18 of Salin and Zimmerman's Rules of Play Game Design Fundamentals, MIT Press, 2004.
Wow.
I wasn't expecting references.
Yeah, I didn't bring references, sorry guys.
Stepping it up.
And the last time I ran Colossus of Atlantis, we basically, about 3 times during the game, everybody got together and they would vote one of the factions off the island, which was a play on the ostracism ritual in ancient Athens, where the most unpopular politician would get exiled from Athens for a decade. And those teams that got exiled then had the fun job of trying to agitate through their friends a recall to help Atlantis survive its next crisis. So lifeboats, that's my entry.
because you sent this one to me, and I thought it was fascinating because I don't actually think any game in the UK scene has used a lifeboat mechanic. And are you two able to? So that's that like that
maybe
alone.
back in the day, but
Yeah.
not my memory. No.
Because it's a mechanic that I love the idea of. Like I really like the idea of it being you're flipping sides in a way, and it's a nice way to add like a good level of narrative tension to a mega game, and it's a different plot hook. When we did the Mega Jam, which was us designing a mega game in 48 hours, which was both a great and terrible idea. One of the things that we could do was like the idea of a flip halfway through. So you were designing a game where actually halfway through what you thought was true turned out to be like the exact opposite, which is how we did things that we did for our thing. Was what you think is like really helpful resource is the equivalent of radiation, is actually making your life more difficult and is making the world blow up. How are you going to solve that? But at the beginning of the game you think, oh, this is really great, it does all these things for me. And like the idea of flipping the state of a game like that is, I think, something that not a lot of mega games have tried, and I think they should do more.
Yeah, no, I agree, definitely.
And again, like, because it's a museum with infinite budget, all those going straight into the museum. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I think that I quite like the idea of a mechanic wing, because I think there was a lot of mechanics in there. I think there's a lot of mechanics that have been used in very few games that people haven't seen, and so again, like if you've thought of a mechanic in a game, please do dump it in the chat. I am keeping an eye on it, and we're going to come back to everything at the end when we've got a bit more time. Right, and then the final wing in our Megagame Museum was the Setting Museum, which again was incredibly vague as an idea and very open-ending. So I'm quite interested to see what people bring. What I brought was the imaginatively titled "The Dying Throes of a Power-Mad Dictator." So I'm thinking of things like Eugenia from The Generalissimo is Dead, which is Kira O'Sullivan, the V. Caesar from Henchman, which is Jim Warman's sort of mini game based on Hitler's Henchman, and then Kind of England from By the Grace of God by Ed Silverstone. And those settings are fascinating for me because they basically say to you, you are in a losing position, you are going to lose, but your leader thinks that everything is fine and they're crazy. And how do you come out of this with at least one limb at the end of it? I think the mega games are at their best when they explore a theme or ask a question. I think that's one of the ethoses Jim's always said about his thing. So for Running Hot, my entire ethos of that is an unbridled hellscape of a cyberpunk actually inevitable if you start off with that thing? If so, how does that happen? If it doesn't happen, why doesn't it happen? And those games basically asking, when everything is lost, but your leader thinks that everything is fine, what do you do? And I think that's a really useful and interesting question. We've got a whole bunch of academic stuff that's happened, not in the museum, over MegaCon, and I think that's one of the real powers of mega-gaming, at least to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'd throw in, there's other games, Ben Moore's Iran Iraq game, where you had the crazy dictators as leaders. That's, there was the excitement and terror of having to go and report failure to them or even success to them was always great fun. So I think it's a really fun mechanic, but also, as you say, instructive in many ways. So yeah, it's great.
So that's a good thing. Dillon, do you want to start with your setting?
Well, I emailed in something. My line was, nothing interesting happens after the fall of Rome. So my entry for the museum is a scale model of Rome showing signs of fire damage. And so my interest in this topic goes back to my very first mega game that I played in 1989. It was a Saturday night at a weekend convention hosted by the Christchurch Wargaming Society, and Andre Evers, who was one of the older gamers there, decided to take a 1970s Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire game for 5 players and turn it into a team game. And I had the fun job of playing Attila the Hun. And sort of game turn 1, we arrive on the map. Game turn 2, the Franks and the Goths scarper out of our way, and we reach the Roman Empire's border. And the Roman teams score points by not spending money. And the Western Roman Empire had this brilliant idea that if they dismantled 50% of their border forces, they would save an enormous amount of money. So we get to this border, and again, it's an old school game, so it has hexes and zones of control, but the forts don't exert zones of control in the adjacent hexes. So when you dismantle half the border forts, you open an avenue directly into the empire. And the first thing we run into is a road. And where do all Roman roads lead? Rome. So game turn 3, the Huns sack Rome, capture the emperor, and it is all downhill for the Roman Empire from there. And I had a great time. And a year or two later, when I ran into an article on a UK Megagame, Springtime for Adolf, I went, I want to do this. And so here I am 30 years later, still designing, playing, running, and now mentoring some local aspiring designers. So yeah, nothing interesting happens after the fall of Rome. I had a quick squiz through Wikipedia today, and there's about 18 times that Rome has fallen. So you can think of Rome in the conceptual sense, you know, the Republic, the Empire, Rome itself, Constantinople, Moscow, those all have claims to be Rome's, but you have the Gauls sacking it in the 4th century BC, end of the Roman Republic. The Goths sack Rome 3 times. And, you know, history is sometimes stranger than fiction. In the Middle Ages, and when Rome was a bit of an anarchy, at one point in 897, a dead pope was exhumed and put on trial, which I just love the idea of, you know, trying to sentence a corpse to death.
I'm fairly certain that has happened in at least 2 mega games, and possibly ones that I was also running. It's the sort of things that happen.
Yeah.
How
so,
do you plead? Why aren't you answering?
obviously has something to hide. Or even more recently, 1870, the Italian army enters Rome and annexes it to the Kingdom of Italy. Not until 1929 where the Pope recognizes that Italian unification has occurred. And you can still get the Nazis in because June 1944, Rome gets liberated by the Allies. So yeah, that's my entry for settings, is the city of Rome and variations thereof.
Yeah, wonderful. Becky, do you want to go next?
Sure. I've taken a bit more of a literal approach to this, and I've picked a game with a setting that I think is just a great example. And it's Red Planet Rising. And the reason why I think this deserves a place in the museum is because it's a setting where the traitor mechanic fit in so seamlessly with the setting that it was virtually indistinguishable. So the classic traitor game is Den of Wolves, and having played and very much enjoyed being a traitor at Den of Wolves, you are a traitor, you are a wolf, you have your interests lie completely with the wolves, you want to sabotage the survivor fleet. That's your motivation, and it's not very organic, and you can't be reasoned with. You are just a traitor against the survivor fleet. Whereas in Red Planet Rising, the setting is on a post-apocalyptic Mars, and it is the government of Mars slowly sort of emerging and trying to re-establish itself on Mars. And the traitors that emerge are pro-Earth traitors. And it makes sense that on Mars, there would be traitors that are favouring Earth's position. And it honestly, when I was playing the game for the first time, I didn't even think that these were people that had been pre-planted by Control to say that they actually were in favour of Earth. It just felt like an organic thing that was coming out of the game. I'm very often very against the idea of traitor plots in games, particularly ones that haven't been sort of briefed in advance that there might be traitors in the game, because it can be so jarring just to have someone acting completely wrong and you can't really discern why, and it's basically because they've been told to by Control. In this game, the traitor mechanic just worked so well, so perfectly. And yeah, so I would like it to have a lovely little traitor spotlight on it saying, traitor, how to traitor.
I think the other stuff with like Red Planet Rising is that every faction in that is like incredibly well thought out, and I think like whenever I've spoken to Andrew about it, he's always said that it was basically a case of like, if someone goes into cryosleep for 300 years and the only thing they have is like a single idea, what comes out of it? So like everything that comes out of it is kind of completely understandable but also completely insane. And like I think, as you say, like the idea that they're being like Earth sympathizers when the rest of the world looks as crazy as it does is not particularly surprising.
Yeah.
Alex, do you want to give us your setting?
Sure. So I feel I've done my duty to history with my last couple of picks. So I'm going to be totally self-indulgent this time and pick Cyberpunk as my setting. So obviously one of my games, Marie Shades, is full-on 80s cyberpunk inspired. Crisis on Elysium has elements of cyberpunk in it as well. But I'm not the only one. Obviously, Paddy, you've done cyberpunk games. Other people have too, and that's kind of why I'm picking it. Really, is that I think for whatever reason, it wasn't a setting that was really done historically. People have done sci-fi, fantasy, and horror games before, but never really done a cyberpunk game. But I think the last sort of 4 or 5 years, loads of games have sort of used it as a kind of theme, as a setting, to the point that it's super common now. And I think that's why it deserves to be in the museum. But I think it deserves to have more mega games too, because I think it's the sort of setting that works where everyone's kind of awful, everyone's at everyone else's throats. It has so many like classic tropes and things you can just throw into it that just fit the mega game kind of play style, really, of people stabbing each other in the back and sort of up to no good. So yeah, I think Cyberpunk is a perfect setting for mega games and needs to be in the museum.
Yeah, I do. I think what I like the most about the cyberpunk setting is the natural splitting of the game, which makes people like in opposition, but not in a particular, like not actually particularly hard.
Yeah,
so
yeah. You can still work together if you want to, sort of thing.
And like you're kind of encouraged to, and most people will cross the boundary and work into the other thing. I'm a big fan. I think also like the thing that I quite liked about it was you could really play with team structures with it, because if you're working for a corporation, obviously you've got like this really strict hierarchy. Whereas if you're just like a gang member, then what hierarchy do you really have? Like maybe someone's in charge, but you've got that. And I thought that was really interesting to play with.
Yeah, and it lets you do asymmetric things exactly, just as you described in lots of ways. You get two very different sorts of game in one, and I think that's always interesting. So yeah, Cyberpunk.
Yeah, Cyberpunk is great. I'm looking forward to more cyberpunky stuff happening, and like, but also I'm quite. What I've also really want is I want more takes on cyberpunk. So not just the like taking that ethos of the 80s cyberpunk and going, okay, well, how do we play with this in a weird way? So Seamus Spates has got his cyberpunk bread and circuses.
Delta Ball. Yeah, that looks really fascinating.
And like the thing I like about that one is that it's like no one's going to have a revolution against the cyberpunk. Like everyone's there, like is intentionally feeding into that idea and making sure it continues to work. I say like my view was like, is the idea of cyberpunk actually inevitable if you have that starting point? I think that's a really interesting question to ask things. It's good. Again, I can't see any reason why not put in any of them some good thing. It's almost like this is an entirely light-hearted panel, and I was going to put everything in anyway. So we've got like a couple more minutes of which to play with stuff. We've got a couple of questions in the chat and a couple of other things. So the first one I want to pull out, John Keyworth points out Jonathan Pickles' game, The Real Heroes, and says that the villain's role in that is a really good mechanic he thinks should go in the museum. So I think both of us have been villains for that game, Becky, because you were there for the first one and then I was for the second one. But the entire point of the villain role was that you were a super villain whose entire purpose was to get beat down by the last couple of turns of the game, but you had like this whole narrative plot to go to and then see what happened at the end of it. And you'd of course end up with people helping you along because they thought you were doing nice things, and then it turned out of course you were doing things. But it's a really, really nice nice style of role where your job is to is to play the game and to make sure, and you're definitely not control. It's not a plumpire role, but it's very plumpire. It's plumpire light.
You're serving a purpose to make a good game, sort of thing, as well as
I think it's a plumpire role.
Oh,
I think it's a plumpire role.
I think it's slightly more player than plumpire. Like it's certainly more the playery side of it.
That's like having like bacon and eggs for brunch and saying that, like, you know, that's more lunchy, you know, like it's still brunch, you know.
Oh, John's arguing. John's saying that we should just put plumpires in.
I think plumpires. Yeah, I agree with plumpire roles. And
I think it's a bit underused as something we need to. Some more games are doing it, but yeah, it's probably an underused mechanic that we should look to do more. I think
it's nice that not everyone is against you as a control. Someone's going to try and I agree. As arguing that the villain roles have a lot more agency than the average plumpire, and I think that's kind of my point. I think they have granted, like, their entire purpose is to fail, but they've got a lot of freedom with which how to do it. But I'll also accept it's a plumpire.
Maybe plumpires just need more agency, because I would say it's very similar to something like the Mad King roles that Tim plays in like all the games.
Every game ever.
Yeah, pretty much. Where he's got complete agency to act as he believes the Mad King would act, in the same way that the villains at Real Heroes / whatever it was called before had agency to act as they thought their villain would act. But, you know, realistically, that is what a plumpire role is. It's you doing a bit of acting while fundamentally not undermining the designer's objective for that character type thing. So I think, and to be honest, I put the teachers at Trope High in that category as well. And I think it is used in a lot more places than you'd immediately think. But yeah, I think it's a great sort of role, and definitely has a place in the museum.
One of the questions that someone popped in, which is, if you could save one map from any game in the museum, what would it be, and what was so good about it? I'm going to just throw that open to everyone else, because I've tended to avoid map roles in literally everything. So,
what was Bernard's Russian Revolution, Russian Civil War game, Becky? The
Red
one
Dawn.
Yeah, that was it. That had lovely maps. Really pretty maps with these big flags for all the pieces. It looked really nice. I mean, mechanically they were pretty simple hex maps for sort of basic war game, but they looked lovely. So yeah, from an aesthetic point of view, I'd throw them in there definitely.
I think the map that I would put in isn't so much a map, it's more just a vivid recollection of a thing happening on a map. And that was Not Over by Christmas / Still Not Over by Christmas. Whenever Rob Cooper would go in with, this was a Cold War gone hot mega game, he'd go in with these tiny little, what's the word? Models of mushroom clouds. And he'd just go in and just sort of sidle up to the map and then just reach out, put it down, and then wait for people to notice. And I was control at the second game, and I was causing the nukes at the first game. So I always saw it, and just like watching other players just slowly be like, oh my God, what's happened? Yeah.
Dillon, you got any maps that you would like to call out?
The map that I spent the most time on designing a game was for a Cold War version of Watch the Skies that I ran. And I have just trying to upload that into the little panel file for people to look at. But you know, I tried resizing the map. Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to best place the continents and so forth for printing it up at a large scale and everything, and how to project everything so the continents looked of a more realistic size than the standard Mercator projection. Made a few mistakes. It's just when you do this, Europe turns out to be really, really, really tiny, and it was actually too small to fit the NATO and Warsaw Pact combat units. So I could have done that better, but I thought it was quite pretty.
One of the things, so First Contact, which is the 200 player, not Watch the Skies, one of the things that when I saw the playtest for that, like every component on that is just dripping with like absolute love and thing. Like every time I've seen like bits of the playtest and pictures of all of the components, not necessarily just the map. I think it looks very good.
It does look impressive, but let's not feed
Yeah.
Chris's ego anymore.
I was actually thinking the exact same thing. So I think we all jointly decided not to feed Chris's ego, and I think we should continue.
Okay, wonderful. So we've got like another 5-10 minutes. If anyone from the chat has got any additional things, if we get any from the chat, has anyone got any other things from any previous rounds they would like to add that they haven't?
Couple of games I want to throw in as more just one-off games that were only run once, but I think are important to the kind of overall story. So just really quickly, Watch the Skies 2, which was the first really big game that of the sort of new generation. It was the second shut up and sit down video. It was my first game, so much like you guys, personally important. But I think it was the one that I think Watch the Skies caught the world attention. Watch the Skies 2 kind of really pushed what a mega game could be, and really promoted it. So that I'd like to throw that in. And then also really quickly, the Urban Nightmare State of Chaos wide area mega game, which was the crazy experiment where the same game ran in sort of a dozen places around the world at the same time, and all fed into one central kind of federal hub. So I think those two games were unique experiences that are really important in the sort of overall story of mega games.
Is the entire point of putting Urban Nightmare in there as a big warning sign to not do it again?
Well, you see, I think we should do it again. I know Jim probably still has nightmares about it, but I think
every single time someone asks Jim, like, "Oh, how should I look about doing this?" his answer is "Don't." So
I think everything we've learned over the last 2 years in the pandemic and how to do games online and how to communicate with Zoom and Discord and all these other tools, I think you could do it a lot more smoothly than it was 5 years ago or 5-6 years ago, wherever it ran. So I think someone needs to pick up that baton and do it. Not me, but someone else.
I'm fairly certain everyone says someone else should definitely do that. It's a good thing. Anyone else got anything they want to think should put into the museum?
I've got a game that I'd like to put in again, just because it did something that, again, I'm not sure that this was the right idea, but it was Bernie Ganley's 1866 and all that, where they actually ran the same game twice in the same room at the same time.
Ooh.
And parallel alongside each other. I think it was just very, very oversubscribed. And it was a bit crazy. I was control at that game. It was a bit crazy because I do remember at one point, I can't remember what king, but one of the kings got up on stage and gave an announcement that was relevant to half the room. And I could see a lot of the players just being like, for a minute, like, oh no, that's not my king, that's a different king. But again, it's just one of those things that you just need to sort of do occasionally, like do something a bit differently, because they could have done that and it could have been like, oh god, this is really cool. And I bet for Bernie it was really cool to sort of see two copies of the same game taking place at the same time, to sort of like be able to compare how they went and how differently they went, and maybe if they were going more differently, but then a player overheard something from somewhere else and that changed the way that they were doing things. So I think that should have a place.
That's interesting. It's probably good for the designer from a feedback point of view, because sometimes things go wrong and you're not sure, was it just a really weird fluke or is it actually a fundamental problem in the game? So running it twice at the same time, perfect way to check.
Cuts down on venue hire costs.
True.
On a similar sort of vein, I think it's also one of the things that I think should go in the museum would be Trope High, Becky's American high school game, entirely because Trope High is very different to a lot of things that came before it. I know we've had some similar stuff that's come out a bit later, so I think you could definitely argue that Fate of the World, which is Holly Wall's game that was run a few months back in Glasgow, is probably got the same sort of genus as that, but this Megagames not being this quite deadly serious thing that it is, even when it's not in a particularly things that, and this idea of it being, it's a high school, can you do a mega game about a high school? And the answer was yes you can, which then kind of meant that you could do a mega game about literally anything, which I think was a good thing for the hobby on a whole.
I think as Holly and as Alex, who did Monsterville Mansion, and as I all realise, you can only do it if there is also the fate of the world somewhere going on in the background, like whether that's an apocalypse that's already happened, whether that is going into a mansion where some zombies and some witches are having like the greatest battle of all times, or whether it's like there's actually secretly a Russian spy or and several time travelers running around in the background. Not sure you could do a mega game just straight up in a high school. I mean, maybe you could.
It's a challenge, isn't it?
Do it.
So just the last thing we'll finish off. Marshall Miller has asked, if you were adding individual people to the museum, who would get a wax statue?
Wow.
So obviously me, because I'm the curator, but
Those would be
anyone
gold,
else?
surely.
Yes, good point. Yes. Okay, we got to spend that budget somehow.
Well,
surely it's got to involve Jim Woolman.
Yeah. Jim's the easy pick.
I mean, it would be called the Jim Woolman Museum of Megagames, surely, right? I think he would doubt it. Like,
I think so. And then obviously Paddy Griffith as well, from Memphis Mangler fame and the early games, in that early wing, But I think it's a bit early for statues for most people, though. I think maybe lots of people at MegaCon would like a statue in the fullness of time, but it's a bit early, isn't it? So.
I mean, other people off the top of my head, I think possibly Paul Howarth is possibly worth it, because I think they did a lot of work being like a big powerhouse of Pennine Megagames when they started up, which has meant that Pennine happened and Pennine got to come up with a different kind of spin on Megagames, which then also inspired True North to happen and all those sorts of other places. So you had this very differing style that kind of grew out of the different regions. And I'm not entirely sure on my history, but Pennine I think was one of the first non-London based groups. So
in the UK, yeah, I think there were non-UK ones. So I know that there was Megagames Netherlands, for example. And then, as Dillon's been mentioning, there's been stuff going on the opposite side of the world for a while.
Kevin's pointed out Dave Bounty, which is also a very good shout. I think that Dave's meticulous history, recording, would be worth recognizing.
Maybe one of Tim Campbell shouting at somebody.
Well, I believe I was the first woman to design a mega game. I don't know my mega game history as well.
I think so. Certainly,
so at the very least, I can be in there for a while until there are many more
that's
influential female mega gamers who push me off a pedestal. But one of the things I'd like to mention is that the mega game page on Wikipedia has a personalities section, and that has been a fantastic source of hilarity in previous years when people in the mega gaming sphere realized they could edit Wikipedia pages. And mostly, if you go back and look through the history of it, there is a lot of people adding in references to people that eventually got taken out by actual serious Wikipedia people, and the only person currently mentioned in that is Jim Woolman. So
sounds probably about right, I think.
If you wanted a subtle touch, you would just plant some chestnut trees outside the museum. From my point of view, the Chestnut Lodge Wargaming Club, they've kind of been in the nucleus for a lot of the design thinking and play testing. And the year I was in London, I spent a lot of time hanging out with the people there, and they were great fun to play games with and talk about stuff with.
Yeah. No, that's definitely.
Wonderful. Right, that takes us to the end of our hour chat. Thank you all very much to my panel of Mega Game experts for bringing some great games. Thank you everyone who's been in the chat giving us suggestions and heckling, as the case may be. It's been wonderful. So it's been a wonderful start to MegaCon. Hopefully we'll have more Mega Game museums. After this comes out, I might even write this up and we can have a web page somewhere of the things that we put in a Mega Game museum. We can add to this as time goes on, and I could be my own little pioneer in this little scene. So wonderful. So thank you all very, very much, and we will sign off, and we'll probably see you all in the pub.
Cool. Thanks, Paddy. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.